In the autumn of the year 30, in a villa on the slopes above the Bay of Naples, a team of Roman slaves is pushing a garden. Not a wheelbarrow. A garden. A wheeled wooden bed, heavy with soil, rolled out at dawn to chase the sun across the courtyard and rolled back under cover at dusk. On cold nights, it was sealed beneath frames glazed with thin sheets of transparent stone. A primitive greenhouse, centuries before glass was cheap enough to waste on plants. An entire microeconomy of labor, engineering, and imperial money mobilized every single day of the year. And all of it existed to grow one thing: a cucumber. The Emperor Tiberius, a man who ruled a territory of roughly 50 million people, who commanded legions that could erase a nation from the map, reportedly could not get through a day without one on his table. Winter, summer, drought, it didn't matter. Pliny the Elder wrote that Tiberius was never without it. So think about that for a second. The most powerful man on Earth, bending the resources of a superpower toward the guaranteed daily delivery of a vegetable that is, by weight, about 96% water. 96% nothing. Today, that same object sits in the door of your refrigerator. It costs less than a phone charger. You've probably let one go soft and thrown it out without a thought. 2,000 years ago, it was a flex of absolute power. How did that happen? How did a bland, watery gourd from the foothills of the Himalayas, a plant with almost no calories, no spice, no gold in it, end up driving greenhouse technology, reshaping how empires fed their armies, distorting tax law, and pushing grown men to cheat, lie, and file patents over its exact shape? Because here's the strange truth. Nobody ever launched a war for cucumbers. No fleet burned over them. And yet, the cucumber quietly became the excuse for some of the most obsessive technological races in history. Races over how to cheat the seasons, how to defeat rot, and how to control nature itself. The cucumber is not the prize. It's the fingerprint. Follow it, and you find the whole grubby machinery of human ambition pressed into something you'd normally ignore in a salad. So, let's follow it. From a Himalayan valley, through an emperor's obsession, across an ocean, into a Victorian glasshouse arms race, and finally, back to your fridge. Let's start at the beginning. The real beginning. The cucumber comes from India. More precisely, from the humid valleys south of the Himalayas, where its wild ancestor still grows. A small, savage, unbearably bitter fruit that would make you spit if you bit into it. That bitterness is a chemical defense, cucurbitakin, evolved to keep animals away. Humans, being humans, decided to fix that. Over generations of selection, we're talking at least 3,000 years of cultivation, possibly more, farmers bred the bitterness down and the water content up, turning a toxic little gourd into something cool, crisp, and edible. That was the first act of genetic engineering in this story, done entirely by hand, one seed at a time. From India, it traveled, and it traveled fast, because it did something almost no other crop could do in the ancient world. It made water portable. In the brutal heat of Mesopotamia and Egypt, a food that was mostly clean, cool moisture, that you could grow in a field and eat straight off the vine, wasn't a snack. It was survival. Cucumbers show up in the cuneiform record of ancient Sumer. They appear in Egypt, where laborers ate them by the basketful. And here's a detail people forget. In the Book of Numbers, when the Israelites are wandering the desert and complaining bitterly about their diet, do you know what they cry out for? What they say they miss about slavery in Egypt? The cucumbers. Chapter 11, verse 5. They remember the fish, the melons, the leeks, and the cucumbers of Egypt. A people are literally so miserable in the wilderness that the memory of cheap green water on a hot day feels like paradise lost. That's the origin of its power. In a dry, sun-hammered world, the cucumber was reliable relief. Ordinary abundance in places where abundance was never ordinary. But abundance has a problem. It rots. A fresh cucumber is glorious for about a week, and then it's a puddle. And that single weakness, perishability, is what turns this humble plant from a summer treat into a genuine economic force. Because the moment humans learned to stop it from rotting, the cucumber stopped being food. It became a commodity. The technology was pickling. Salt, water, acid, time. It's one of the oldest preservation methods on Earth, running back over 4,000 years in Mesopotamia. And pickling did to the cucumber what refining did to oil. It took something perishable and local and turned it into something storable, tradable, shippable. Something you could load onto a ship, carry across a sea, and sell in a port where fresh vegetables were a fantasy. A fresh cucumber is a picnic. A pickled cucumber is cargo. And that is where the money starts. Because whoever controlled preservation controlled distance. And whoever controlled distance controlled the trade. Ancient writers were obsessed with it. There's a persistent claim that Cleopatra credited pickles for her looks, that Roman soldiers were rationed them, that the pickle became a kind of currency of health and vigor across the Mediterranean. Some of that is embroidered legend. You should always be suspicious of any ancient figure conveniently endorsing a product, but the core is real. Preservation was value. Salt was the price of it. And the salt trade, remember, was one of the great engines of the ancient economy. The word salary comes from Roman payment in salt. So the humble cucumber quietly hooks itself onto one of the most valuable supply chains in the ancient world. Which brings us back to Rome, and to our emperor, and to the first great act in this story. The birth of the greenhouse, driven almost entirely by the desire to eat cucumbers out of season. This is Act 1. And its protagonist is that same wheeled garden we opened on. Off-season produce, in the ancient world, was close to impossible. Nature had a calendar, and nobody could argue with it. If cucumbers grew in summer, you ate them in summer, and for the rest of the year, you dreamed. The one way around this, the only way, was to physically manufacture a false summer. And so the Romans did. To satisfy one man's daily craving, imperial gardeners built the first known greenhouses in history. Those wheeled beds, chased across courtyards to catch every hour of light, and those winter frames glazed with lapis specularis, thin, translucent sheets of mineral, likely selenite or mica, split fine enough to let the sun through. Understand what that represents. That is human beings, for the first time on record, refusing to accept the seasons, bending physics with architecture, building a machine to lie to a plant about what month it is, and they did it for a cucumber. The absurdity is the point. The technology that would one day feed billions, controlled environment agriculture, the glasshouse, the whole logic of growing what you want, when you want, regardless of climate, was born as an imperial vanity project. A rich man's whim, the Roman equivalent of building a private ski slope in the desert. But vanity is a powerful engine. And once the idea existed that you could defeat the calendar, it never really went away. It just waited for the technology to get cheaper. That would take about 1,700 years. In the meantime, the cucumber did what all good commodities do. It went global. And it did it by hitching a ride on the single most consequential event in the history of food. The Columbian Exchange. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic, he wasn't just carrying men and steel. His ships carried seeds, a floating catalog of the old world ready to be planted in the new. And cucumbers were on board. By 1494, on the island of Hispaniola, modern Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Europeans were planting cucumbers in American soil for the first time. And here's where it gets genuinely wild. The cucumber spread across the Americas faster than the Europeans did. By the time Spanish explorers pushed deep into what is now the southeastern United States in the 1530s, they found indigenous nations already growing cucumbers, plants that had leapt ahead through native trade networks, passed from tribe to tribe, hundreds of miles ahead of any European settler. A plant from the Himalayas, introduced in the Caribbean, was cultivated by peoples in North America who had never seen a Spaniard. That's the quiet ferocity of a good crop. It doesn't need armies. It travels on its own merits, one gardener at a time, until it's everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean everywhere. Within a couple of centuries, the cucumber was growing on every inhabited continent that could support it. A local Indian specialty had become a planetary staple. But planetary staples have a paradox baked into them. The more common a thing becomes, the less it's worth. And the aristocrats of Europe did not like their luxuries becoming common. So they did what aristocrats always do when everyone else can suddenly afford the thing they used to flaunt. They moved the goalposts. If any peasant could grow a cucumber in July, then the prestige couldn't be in the cucumber itself anymore. The prestige had to be in growing it impossibly, out of season, under glass, bigger, straighter, earlier, and more expensively than your neighbor. And that brings us to the strangest chapter in this whole story. The one I still can't quite believe is real. The British Cucumber Wars. Quick pause here, because if you're finding this genuinely enjoyable, if you like the idea that something as boring as a salad vegetable can secretly explain empires and engineers and tax law, that's the entire reason this channel exists. A quick subscribe tells the algorithm to send more of these unlikely histories your way, and it costs you exactly nothing. Alright, back to the British and their extremely serious feelings about vegetables. By the 1700s and 1800s, wealthy Britain had rediscovered Tiberius's dream, the greenhouse, but with real glass instead of shaved mineral. And glass, in Britain, was fantastically expensive. Not because of the material, because of the tax. For nearly a century, from 1746 to 1845, the British government levied a punishing excise duty on glass, taxed by weight, enforced with officials who literally weighed the molten batches. Glass became one of the most heavily taxed substances in the country, which meant a glass house wasn't just a building. It was a rolling monument to how much money you could afford to burn. And what did the British aristocracy choose to grow inside these obscenely expensive glass palaces to prove their wealth to their rivals? Cucumbers. Of course, cucumbers. The out-of-season cucumber, grown under glass in an English winter, became a status symbol so specific that estates built dedicated cucumber houses and hired specialist gardeners whose entire reputation rested on producing the earliest, longest, most perfect specimens. Perfect. That word matters, because cucumbers, left to themselves, grow crooked. They curl. They bend toward the light and coil around obstacles, and a bent cucumber, to the Victorian obsessive, was an embarrassment. A moral failing, almost. So the greatest engineering minds of the age turned their attention to the crisis of the curved cucumber. And I mean the greatest. George Stephenson, the man who built the rocket locomotive, the father of the railways, one of the towering engineers of the entire Industrial Revolution, reportedly devoted some of that colossal brainpower to inventing a glass cylinder. A clear tube you slid over the growing cucumber, forcing it to grow perfectly straight inside the glass. The man who gave the world the railway, building a machine to straighten cucumbers, because that's what status does to smart people. It points their genius at the trivial and convinces them it's the most important thing in the world. The competitions were real, and they were vicious. Prize cucumbers were measured to the fraction of an inch. Gardeners guarded their techniques like state secrets, and there are records of contestants tying weights to the ends of their cucumbers to stretch them longer, and even, allegedly, being caught splicing pieces together to fake a record length. Men were cheating at competitive cucumber growing. Now step back and look at the whole absurd machine. Enormous taxes on glass, industrial-grade engineering, the labor of skilled specialists, outright fraud, an entire pyramid of money and effort and human cleverness balanced on top of a vegetable that is, again, 96% water. That is the cucumber at the peak of its power, not valuable in itself. Valuable as a scoreboard, a way for the rich to keep score against each other, using nature as the playing field. And like every artificial luxury in this story, it was about to collapse. Because the whole thing depended on scarcity being expensive. The greenhouse cucumber was a flex only as long as glass was rare and dear. Take away the price of glass, and the entire tower of prestige comes crashing down. In 1845, Britain repealed the glass tax, and everything changed. Almost overnight, glass became affordable. Greenhouses stopped being the private toys of the ultra-rich and started spreading to ordinary market gardeners. Just 6 years later, in 1851, Britain built the Crystal Palace, a cathedral of iron and glass covering 19 acres, a structure that would have been literally unaffordable a decade earlier. The age of cheap glass had arrived, and cheap glass killed the cucumber's mystique. When any commercial grower could throw up a greenhouse and produce cucumbers by the thousand, the out-of-season cucumbers stopped meaning anything. The scarcity evaporated. The scoreboard broke. What had been an emperor's obsession and an aristocrat's trophy became, within a couple of generations, the cheapest thing on the vegetable stand. Then came the finishing blows. Industrial greenhouses, railways, ironically, Stephenson's own railways, hauling fresh produce across countries overnight. Refrigeration, steamships, global shipping. By the 20th century, the cucumber could be grown anywhere, chilled, and moved across the planet for pennies. The technology that had made it precious, controlled growing, defeating the seasons, became so cheap and so universal that it made the cucumber worthless. That is the cruel arithmetic of the commodity. The very innovation you chase to dominate a market is the innovation that eventually floods it. Rome built greenhouses to make cucumbers exclusive. 2,000 years later, greenhouses made them so common that nobody thinks about them at all. Scarcity created the value. Abundance erased it. And that could have been the end. A luxury, democratized into invisibility. But the cucumber left fingerprints all over the modern world. And once you know where to look, you can't stop seeing them. Look at the Netherlands. That tiny, cloudy, sun-starved country is today one of the largest food exporters on the planet, and it did it by mastering exactly the thing Tiberius dreamed of: growing produce under glass, in defiance of climate, at massive scale. Vast seas of greenhouses, cucumbers among the leading crops, pumping out precise, uniform, straight vegetables year-round. That entire high-tech industry is the direct descendant of an emperor's wheeled garden and a British aristocrat's glass box. The vanity project became an economy. Look at your language. Cool as a cucumber. The phrase is old, showing up in a poem by John Gay back in 1732. And it's not just poetry, it's physics. On a hot day, the inside of a cucumber really can sit noticeably cooler than the air around it, because all that water resists the heat. The idiom is a fossil of the exact quality that made the plant precious in the desert 3,000 years ago. You are quoting Bronze Age agriculture every time you say it. Look at your table. The pickle. The preserved cucumber that first turned this crop into cargo is now a global industry in its own right. Dill pickles, gherkins, cornichons, the pickle on the side of every burger. That whole ecosystem is the great-great-grandchild of the ancient discovery that if you could just stop the cucumber from rotting, you could sell it to someone far away. Preservation was the original value add, and it's still on your plate. And look at the deeper legacy, the one that goes far beyond the vegetable. The obsession with defeating rot, with preserving food against time and distance, didn't stop at pickles. It became one of the great quests of the industrial age. When governments needed to feed armies on the march, feed cities that had outgrown their farmland, feed navies at sea for months, the ancient problem of the perishable cucumber scaled up into the modern science of food preservation. Canning, refrigeration, the whole global cold chain that keeps 8 billion people fed today. All of it descends from the same fundamental fight the first pickle maker was having 4,000 years ago. How do you make abundance last? That question built the modern world, and the cucumber was one of the very first things to ask it. So, let's go back to where we started. To Tiberius, on his terrace above the bay, waiting for slaves to wheel his cucumbers into the sun. To an emperor who could conquer nations but could not, without enormous effort, guarantee himself a simple green vegetable in December. Now, open your refrigerator. There it is. In the drawer, behind the milk, probably a little forgotten. Grown under glass by machines. Tiberius couldn't have imagined, in a country with barely any sun, shipped across the world in a refrigerated truck and sold to you for less than the cost of the fuel it took to get there. A miracle of 3,000 years of human obsession, engineering, taxation, fraud, empire, and invention. And you will eat it without a single thought. That's the real story of the cucumber. Not that it was ever valuable. It never really was. The story is that human beings took something with almost nothing in it and poured centuries of genius and greed and vanity into it anyway, chasing the seasons, chasing status, chasing an edge over the neighbors. We built greenhouses for it. We taxed glass over it. One of the fathers of the railways sat down and engineered a tube to make it straight. We do this. It's what we are. We take the ordinary and we make it a battlefield of ambition. And then, once we've won, we make it so cheap and so common that we forget it was ever a prize at all. The measure of a civilization isn't the treasures it fights for. It's the miracles it learns to ignore. And there's one sitting in your fridge right now.